Good afternoon and welcome to the Isles of Scilly. This afternoon we're going to be going out on a boat trip with a lady called Kathryn Sawyer, who is an archaeologist and a historian, and we're going to be going across to the island of Samson. It is one of the uninhabited islands now, but back in history people did live on it, and what our hope is that we're going to find out a lot more about the people who lived there and why it is now uninhabited.
So Samson, can you go with the dinghy? Yeah, it was 28 pounds. Go, it's on the Sapphire. Perfect, thank you very much.
We boarded onto the Sapphire, which is a really large boat, but because it's an uninhabited island, it means that there's no keys to be able to just get off onto a nice pier. So what we think is that this dinghy that's currently attached to it is something that we're going to have to transfer onto and then do some kind of beach landing, but we're not too sure if it's going to be a wet landing or not. Maybe me putting on some trousers and the thought that it's going to be uninhabited, so it's going to be overgrown with plants, and I didn't want to have shorts on was a bad idea because I can see these leggings getting soaked if it's a wet landing.
Get your feet wet, so you may want to take your shoes and socks off. I say we get right in on the beach with maybe just a foot or so to go. I say, and then we'll be picking you up again at 4:45 tomorrow. We're picking up 4:45, and that'll be on the Sea King picking you up, so it's 4:45 from the beach here.
We've been told that it's likely to be a wet landing, so he's told us all just to get our shoes and socks off in anticipation. He reckons it'll probably only be about a foot or so, but I'm really not too sure how far up I can roll these leggings because they're pretty tight. Yeah, that's about as far as these leggings are going to go. Yeah, that should be fine. Can't pull them up any higher than that.
Stand up if you want.
Yeah, I'll stand up.
Come in the middle if you want to.
What, down?
No, that's fine. Cap up here, if you want to come up here.
So this is the diary entry of the first victim.
Huh? Sorry, is the diary of what?
The first victim to go in the water.
Yeah. Don't worry guys, you're alright there. You're cool, you're cool, we'll be alright. We'll help each other.
Thanks very much.
No worries, see you later.
Did you get wet?
And my feet are wet, but thankfully not my clothing. How about you?
I got wet.
Oh no! You hopped out before she even pulled it further in.
I know. It looked a lot shallower than it actually was.
Oh, but you've got more jeans back at home, right?
Yeah, I do. Oops. Oh no.
She was very grateful though for you helping pull the boat in.
Yeah.
We've arrived on Samson. I think I was expecting that we were going to be the only ones on the island who were here on the boat. I wasn't really thinking it through, but of course people have been able to bring their own little dinghies, and I think a few people have rented kayaks and come across. So there's a few people on here, but it's really not that busy at all. What was interesting is that we weren't able to come at it from the side of St Mary's because the waters were too shallow. So we had to go all the way around the island to the other end of it to be able to then do this beach landing. They can only put 12 people in a dinghy at a time, and this was something that we'd learnt yesterday. We spoke to the boat captain who took us over to Tresco, and because there was a big cruise ship in, I was asking, do they go and collect the passengers? He explained that if it's an expedition cruise, then they do tend to have dinghies so they can do their own onshore excursions, but because of the area being protected here, they can only do that if there's up to 12 people in a dinghy, which I think is why they had to say, stop, wait, we've got 12, and then they're going to bring another boatload of people over in just a moment.
That guy was wearing shorts. Smart.
We've only just made a start, but our guides explained that this island is home to stinking lily. She said that the stinking part is the actual leaf part, so when you rip it off, if you sniff it, it's not actually too bad. It just smells a little bit like Marmite, so I suppose it's one of those things of you either love it or you hate it. Sounds like we've gotten really fortunate with our timings. Just over the last couple of days, the Wildlife Trust have come onto this island and cut back all of these pathways. So our guide was saying that's the only reason why we've been able to come today. And it seems like they are beautifully cut back for us, but she's saying she'll have to see whether it's the whole island or if we're going to have to make some detours as we go. before the last ice age, all of these islands weren't just individual islands. They were in fact one large landmass. You would have been able to walk between each of them, and you also would have been able to walk all the way out to the lighthouse that we went to on our first full day. It means that what is now underwater used to actually be land where people in history had lived on there and farmed on there. So she said if you look out into the water, you can often see old stone walls, and sometimes, even though seaweed has a habit of covering it, you can sometimes also see the stone circles of old huts.
What I should say is that the people living here, obviously from the Middle Ages right up to the mid-19th century, were essentially farming and fishing. That's how they were making their living. That was divided up into lots of little fields, most of them with dry stone walls around them. So they were farming there, so growing crops, keeping livestock, fishing, and between the late 17th and mid-19th century also income from kelp burning, so from collecting seaweed, burning it in stone-lined pits in order to produce soda ash, which was used in glass manufacture. This is where things like shells, animal bones, and obviously vegetable waste as well would have just been dumped here. And there were 100,000 limpet shells in this midden, which was accumulated over the space of about 20 years. And so the temptation is to think that's the staple diet, but of course it wasn't. If you think how much meat there is in a limpet compared with a cow, you know, you need an awful lot of limpets to get a reasonable amount of protein. So limpets were, you know, the food for hard times. So in the spring, if you've eaten all the meat and fish that you dried or smoked the autumn before and the weather isn't good enough to go out fishing, then limpets are an easy source of food. They don't run very fast. You can be sure that you're going to get some, and you put them in a broth, and that keeps you going. And other times of poverty, because Scilly had some very hard times in the late 18th and early 19th century. So for some people, limpets might have been, you know, a major part of their diet.
We've come right up onto the hill, and what we've just gone and learned is that the stonework, even though it looks right now like it's dry stone wall, originally it wasn't built in that way, and instead there was ram, which apparently was fine when there was still a roof intact, but since the roof's gone and obviously the heavens have opened and the water's washed it away, but to try and preserve it, because they reckon if they don't do any preservation to it, it's going to be gone within the next 20 years, they've started to fill it in, obviously not using the same materials. The other really cool thing is that we've got some wood, and what she was explaining is that back when these houses were built, there wouldn't have been any trees still growing on this island, and so it's actually wood that's been reclaimed from nearby shipwrecks.
This is Caprosma repens. It hasn't got an English name, I'm not just showing off the Latin. So this is a plant from New Zealand which was introduced to Scilly for use in shelter hedges around the flower field, so it will have been here since the late 19th century. Now, because Samson was abandoned before flower farming started, there are nothing like the number of introduced species here that you will see on the inhabited islands. So as far as I know, there's no Bermuda buttercup here, there's no three-cornered leek, all these plants that have come in with the narcissus bulbs from southern Europe and North Africa. But of course, this has berries which the birds eat, and they then fly over to Samson, or some of the seeds of you know, invasive species are carried by the wind, so Samson isn't safe from that.
We've now undertaken the short climb up onto the North Hill. Now, whilst there isn't much in the way of post-medieval history found on this side, there is a lot from the Bronze Age.
So you'd place your burial cremated remains usually in a pot inside here, and then you'd block this entrance up with small stones so that it wouldn't get disturbed, and then next time you had the need to bury someone, just take the stones out of the entrance, and there's usually some kind of, you know, space here. put the next burial in, lock it up again. So there's a site on St Martin's, which has nothing really surviving, which had about 100 burials in it of that kind, with radiocarbon dates ranging over about 500 years. So these are kind of long-term burial sites.
Sadly, we've come to the end of our time here on Samson as the boat's here ready to pick us up. But that said, there's a lot more things that I want to share with you, but I think I'm going to have to talk about it when we get back to St Mary's. A guided tour of Samson did go a long way to help explain why the island had been abandoned. Way back in history, when a father passed away, the land that he owned was then divided up amongst all of his sons, which obviously if he had a lot of sons, it meant that the land was getting smaller and smaller. And each time that a father would pass away, that small parcel of land became even smaller still again. It meant that unfortunately it got to a point whereby the farming became so difficult because the parcels of land were so teeny tiny. It does make me wonder if maybe that goes a long way to explain why the fields over on St Martin's from our second full day here were so small. Augustus Smith, who took on ownership of Tresco, decided that he didn't like this idea, and he was powerful enough to turn around and say, no, we're done with that, new rule. Now it's going to be that the eldest son inherits just the entirety of his father's land. Therefore, any other sons and all of his daughters have got two options. They can either find paid work to be able to sustain themselves, still getting to live on the Isles of Scilly, or if they're unable to do that, they must relocate to the mainland and get work over there instead. He was very much of that ethos of teach a man how to fish instead of giving a man a fish. He set up education on the islands that was compulsory, and it was compulsory a few decades before it was on the mainland. He would charge parents just 1 penny per week for the education, but if the children didn't turn up to school, then the parents were fined a shilling a week. So it was within their interests to make sure that they turned up and got an education. The idea was that when they then went to the mainland, they were able to then find work relatively easily. It helped that they were educated in things such as maritime navigation, and they could get the entry-level jobs working in things like the Royal Navy or the Merchant Navy quite easily. Once they'd been working in there at an entry-level position, because they were able to read and write, they could sit the tests that then allowed them to be able to get promotions up through the ranks within these sorts of jobs. This then meant that a lot of people were leaving, not only Samson, but also the Scilly Isles in general. It used to be that back in the 1800s, or towards the beginning of the 1800s, there were about 2,800 people living there. And then with this whole idea that people were going to have to relocate to the mainland, it ended up dwindling down to about 2,000. I understand that it's about 2,200 today. Now this of course hit all of the islands on the Isles of Scilly, but the reason why Samson was particularly hit was because it only had a population of 40 at the height of how many people lived there. It then got to a point where we only had about 6 people left, and they were all very elderly and really too old and frail to be able to keep up with the demands of having to farm the agriculture of the land in order to create food to sustain themselves. Therefore, despite the fact that they legally had the right to remain there, Augustus Smith asked them, would you like to be relocated to St Mary's? And their answer was yes, please. At that point, it then became an uninhabited island. Some people do wonder if maybe Augustus Smith had a bit of an ulterior motive, because he lived on Tresco and he had beautiful views out over the waters onto Samson, and perhaps he just didn't want people spoiling the luck of it. Once those final people had relocated onto St Mary's and no one was living there, he then built a stone wall, which we could see today when doing the tour. And this stone wall was so that he could create a deer park. Now, what really made me chuckle was that he invested in fallow deer. Now, if you know anything about fallow deer and you're looking at the size of the wall, you will realise that those fallow deer are more than capable of jumping over a wall of such small height. So, of course, as soon as he released the fallow deer, they jumped the wall. And as stories say, the locals came along and they poached the deer and ate them for dinner. Some of them attempted to swim across to the likes of Tresco and Briar, but unfortunately these fallow deer were not very good swimmers and they drowned. He'd also wondered about maybe putting things like emus and ostriches onto there, but it never went into fruition, and it's just got to a point now whereby the island is truly uninhabited, and the Wildlife Trust, as I've already said, maintain the footpaths so that people can walk around on the island and discover it and all of its natural beauty.